Good afternoon again. I'm gonna start us off. People are still trickling in, but I don't want to lose too much time at the front. My name is Meg McBride. I'm a research analyst in CNA's Countering Threats and Challenges program. And on behalf of our president and CEO, Catherine McGrady, I'd like to welcome you to what I'm sure will be an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. Before we begin, though, a few administrative notes. Each of our speakers will provide some framing remarks for about 10 minutes. This will be followed by a moderated discussion, and then we'll turn to audience questions and comments. If you're participating through Zoom, you can send a question through the Q&A feature. The chat box is open, but we'd request that you not submit questions there. It's a little tricky for us to keep track of them. Also, if you're calling in, you can send a question to CNA_NSS@CNA.org. That's the same email that sent you the dial-in information yesterday. Please note that today's event is unclassified and has been advertised publicly. We're recording the event and may post it on our site or social media accounts following the event. If this is your first acquaintance with CNA, we're a nonprofit research organization comprised of the Center for Naval Analyses and the Institute for Public Research. The Center for Naval Analyses is a federally funded research and development center for the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, but we do work across the Department of Defense and other U.S. government agencies. Our Institute for Public Research supports Homeland Security, public safety, and emergency operations at all levels of government. The National Security Seminar Series is a CNA initiative to bring together thought leaders from across the U.S. government, academic and research institutions, the private sector, and U.S. partner nations to share their expertise, facilitate discussions, and contribute to an ongoing dialogue about issues affecting U.S. national security. The goal of the series is to raise critical questions facing U.S. national security, illuminate them from differing perspectives, and create an environment where these topics can be discussed at a professional level without the normal constraints we face in our day jobs. The theme of this year's series is National Security in a Post-Pandemic World. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted almost every aspect of life in 2020, forcing us to reshape our relationships, rethink the ways we work and travel, find new ways to connect and communicate, and redefine our sense of safety. The pandemic has had similar implications for national security, affecting U.S. security partnerships, operations, and logistics, the health and safety of government and military personnel, and these effects will likely continue to resonate for years. In 2021, CNA's National Security Seminar Series will consider the ways in which the pandemic has reshaped the contours of the national security landscape and explore challenges the U.S. will face in a changed world. The series will draw upon a wealth of expertise from across the organization to spotlight emerging issues and alter trajectories that national security leaders will need to consider as they look to the future. And now to turn to today's specific events. As COVID continues to rapidly spread in many parts of the world, the effects of the pandemic on the national security landscape are still revealing themselves, and the difficulties of ensuring physical safety while battling a major health crisis are apparent. Today's violent extremist organizations, or VEOs, are operating in a fundamentally changed landscape and using the pandemic to drive forward their movements and beliefs. As the instability and chaos of COVID create new opportunities for VEOs to recruit and operate, there has been a clear increase of their activity across much of the Middle East and Africa. Similarly, increasing political polarization and the backlash COVID mitigation measures led to violence from U.S. domestic VEOs. This seminar will explore how VEOs have adapted during the pandemic and the effect of COVID on the U.S. mitigation strategy. We'll consider a range of questions, including how have VEOs benefited from the uncertainty and confusion engendered by the pandemic? How has COVID affected the ability of U.S. and its allies and partners to respond? And how should U.S. counterterrorism policy adapt to effectively respond to the newest evolution of VEOs? I'm joined today by three outstanding and accomplished individuals who will each provide background and nuance as a part of this discussion. John Cohen will speak to the impact of COVID on domestic VEOs. He currently serves as the Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He has more than 3 decades of experience in law enforcement, counterintelligence, and homeland security, and previously served as a senior expert on global threats for the Argonne National Laboratory, an on-air expert for ABC News on homeland security, terrorism, counterintelligence, and law enforcement issues, and an adjunct professor in the Georgetown University Security Studies Program and Center for Security Studies. Pamela Faber will speak on the impact of COVID on foreign VEOs. She's a research scientist at CNA in the Countering Threats and Challenges program and serves as the lead point of contact for CNA's Africa security portfolio. In these roles, she works directly with U.S. government sponsors to research, analyze, monitor, and evaluate critical national security issues, including those pertaining to terrorism and counterterrorism, security cooperation, and external actors in Africa. She was the lead author for a recent public release paper titled Viral Extremism, COVID-19, Non-Traditional Threats, and U.S. Counterterrorism Policy. And Lieutenant General Michael Nagata will speak on the impact of COVID on U.S. counterterrorism policy. He served in the U.S. Army for 38 years, including 34 as a member of U.S. Special Operations Forces. His final government position was Director of Strategic Operational Planning for the U.S. National Counterterrorism Center from 2016 to 2019. During his career, he deployed in multiple contingency and combat special operations and campaigns across 3 continents and worked predominantly in the counterterrorism and counterinsurgency arenas. He also served in both strategy and policy positions in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, the U.S. intelligence community, and U.S. diplomatic posts abroad. Before I turn to our speakers, I want to thank you again for participating in today's seminar. For those of you who know CNA, welcome back. And for new guests, we hope this is the first of many times we'll have the opportunity to engage with you and that we can keep the dialogue started here moving forward. With that, I think that the portion of the event in which I read will end, and I'll turn it over to our speakers for their comments and thoughts on these topics. As I said earlier, our first speaker will be Ms. Pamela Faber, who is going to speak about the impact of COVID-19 on foreign VEOs.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this conversation. It's truly an honor to be here alongside my fellow panelists, so thank you. And with my time, as Meg mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the impact of COVID on international violent extremist organizations. And at CNA, we recently wrote a policy brief on this question. And excuse me, in thinking about how to frame an answer to this question for the brief, it was helpful for me, and I think it might be helpful in this conversation, to start by thinking about what we knew and what we didn't know at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And so what we knew and what we learned and what we continue to learn every day is that COVID has caused a colossal change to all facets of life. It's impacted public health infrastructure, it's impacted employment, the economy, the social and cultural fabric of our lives and our communities. It's been incredibly disruptive across all of these areas. And it's led to an enormous amount of fear and uncertainty and chaos. And in many places, this is still happening, right? And so we knew that this disruption had negative impacts, but what we didn't know was how COVID would impact the very groups that thrive under conditions of chaos and uncertainty. For instance, violent extremist groups who use terrorism as a tactic. Not only do these groups benefit from uncertainty, they actually seek to create it. And so as the devastating effects of the pandemic started to spread across the world, a very interesting question emerged, which was, what impact does the pandemic have on groups that aim to bring about chaos? And so in order to answer this question, CNA and my colleagues, we looked at the impact of COVID on VEOs through different lenses. And I'm going to touch on just a few of them here in the next few minutes. The first lens is the environment. And for the environment, we're not just talking about the physical environment or the climate. We're referring to changes in the operating environment. And so that is, the political, military, social, economic operating space that VEOs, violent extremist organizations, operate in. And the question is, what changes occurred to this space because of COVID? And what we found is that COVID increased global instability that VEOs both benefit from and attempt to amplify. And COVID has threatened the stability of not only previously secure, however you would define that in different ways, but previously secure countries, but also previously insecure countries, creating opportunities for exploitation. And so, for example, in the Sahel, VEOs have been observed attempting to use the pandemic to undermine state authority as governments struggle to respond to the challenge. We also found that COVID has forced many governments to prioritize domestic health and security concerns and initiatives related to COVID, while also attempting to balance internal and external security threats. And this also has been an opportunity for VEOs. And so an example from early in the pandemic was a riot at a Syrian prison that resulted in the escape of ISIS militants. And there are several other examples about, for instance, a decrease in community policing in Nigeria and other places that has been exploited by militant groups. Also on the environment topic, we found that donors and NGOs may struggle to provide funding for stabilization programs in vulnerable countries, and that the loss of such funding could result in increased instability, further straining overextended governments. And so an example here is that Oxfam laid off almost 30% of its staff and withdrew from 18 countries at the start of COVID-19. And they had an enormous footprint across the globe, and they still do. And the UK cut its aid budget by $3.7 billion. And so the less humanitarian support on the ground means that countries may struggle to maintain the basic needs of their populations. A second lens that we can consider the impact of COVID and VEOs is through operations, VEO operations. And what we found is that COVID has led to, and will likely continue to lead to, tactical shifts within VEO groups. They're very responsive to the ongoing situation. And so, for example, there were instances of individuals attempting to attack hospitals, medical centers, officials enforcing lockdown, and ISIS, in its narratives and its publicly facing messaging, encouraged supporters to target places that appeared most vulnerable. And these places are different than they were before the pandemic. And if we allow for a bit of a comparison by looking at previous pandemics and other non-traditional threats that have occurred, we can see that VEOs in the past have attempted to disrupt the distribution of resources and vaccines. And so, for example, during the cholera outbreak in Yemen, Houthi rebels interfered with the distribution of supplies and vaccines by demanding medical supplies for their own personnel and suggesting vaccines were dangerous. And so this is just one example of that. And finally, on this point, we found that VEOs may increase their operational tempo to take advantage of instability spurred by the pandemic. There's historical precedent for this as well. During the 2016 to 2020 cholera outbreak in Yemen and the 2019 Ebola outbreak in the DRC, terrorists affiliated with ISIS used this to gain territory. And following this historical pattern, the limited existing data that we have does show that terrorist attacks have increased in some of these regions since the outbreak of COVID. And this is a concern, this is an ongoing concern. There's specifically a concern that ISIS will use COVID as an opportunity to regroup. In February 2021, the UN warned that VEOs are planning, quote, a rash of pre-planned attacks, close quote, when COVID restrictions lift. So this kind of moves on to the post-COVID scenario as well. The next lens we'll briefly talk through is that of resources. We found that VEOs may use the COVID crisis as an opportunity to bolster the legitimacy of their organizations by delivering medical and social services that local governments struggle to provide. And although, of course, VEOs are not going to be able to fully meet all the demands of the COVID crisis, they don't need to, because pandemics create opportunities for these groups to make inroads, even with very limited resources. And so if a VEO is even able to provide basic supplies like PPE, food, water, when governments cannot, doing so contributes to their legitimacy. And for many of you, this will be a familiar story. It's a tested tactic that VEOs have used. Al-Shabaab, for example, distributed food and medical supplies during the 2017 famine in Somalia, while simultaneously blaming regional governments and the international community for their failure to act. And COVID has also increased new black market opportunities that VEOs can exploit. And the final lens that I'll briefly touch on is that of recruitment. We found that COVID has amplified the risk factors for radicalization and VEO recruitment across the board. But not only has it amplified the risk factors for radicalization, so those are things like time spent online, feelings of anger and frustration, many more. It's also increased the number of people experiencing factors for radicalization. And so what this means is that it's increased the pool of vulnerable folks who are vulnerable to recruitment in both the short and the long term. And we've also seen COVID integrated into the rhetoric that VEOs use to recruit. And so, for instance, we've seen rhetoric claiming that the virus is divine punishment for unbelievers. And we've seen this rhetoric change over time, which has been interesting. For example, ISIS initially asserted that the virus was a punishment for China in response to its mistreatment of the Uyghur population. However, as the virus spread, the narrative changed, and it became ISIS supporters started to describe it as a punishment from God for the West and COVID as a soldier for Allah. Boko Haram claimed that government measures to contain COVID were a part of a war on Muslims. And Al-Qaeda described it as a punishment from God that, quote, exposed the brittleness of a global economy dominated by the United States, close quote. And in addition, I think some of the other panelists may touch on this more, but far-right groups are using the pandemic to justify attacks against minority ethnic communities, who they inaccurately label as responsible for the spread of the disease. And so in sum, what we found was that nearly every facet of VEO activities and things that impact their activities, so the environment, their operations, resources, recruitment, they benefited from the chaotic and widespread effects of the pandemic. And conversely, US and partner forces tasked with containing this threat have been largely negatively affected across these same 5 areas. And so I'll close my remarks there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute and looking forward to the conversation.
Pamela, thank you so much for elucidating not just sort of 5 frameworks to think about, the 5 frameworks that were used in the paper, but also pulling out some really great examples, I think, of foreign VEO activity in those categories. I'm going to hand it over now to Lieutenant General Nagata, who's going to speak primarily about the impact on U.S. counterterrorism policies. So over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and thanks as always to CNA and people like Megan for inviting me and facilitating my appearance here before all of you. So my task is to talk about my view of the relationship or the interplay between the pandemic that we are now gradually coming out of and U.S. counterterrorism policy. I have a few comments about strategy as well, but let me just go ahead and dive into this. My principal concern when it comes to the impact of COVID on terrorism-related policies or strategies in the U.S. government is that I think that the understandable and necessary zeal to place much more of our strategic emphasis and strategic resources on things like great power competition is having the perverse effect of making the U.S. government, broadly speaking, underappreciate how important the impact of this pandemic has been on violent extremism, and as Pamela has already alluded to, primarily beneficial consequences as opposed to detrimental consequences. I'm sure they've suffered somewhat from the pandemic, but in my view, the strategic advantages that have accrued for violent extremism of all types is pretty significant. But I think we're so distracted as a government by other important topics like great power competition that I don't think we appreciate how much of a change COVID and how much of a benefit COVID is creating for violent extremism. So that's kind of my overarching comment. So let me dive into some specifics here. I think, as probably almost everyone on this call understands, but I think it still bears repetition, is that any time there is an erosion of confidence between a population anywhere, that can be overseas, that can be in the United States, between that population and the government that purports to govern them, care for them, support them, protect them, etc., that creates a nutrient breeding ground for violent extremism of various types to emerge. I think what at least from my point of view, is pretty inarguable, is one of the perverse impacts of the COVID pandemic over the last year has been it has broadened, deepened, and accelerated the erosion of confidence between populations pretty much everywhere, including in our own country, and those that purport to govern them. That is one reason why I believe that as a strategic matter, the strategic landscape has tilted in favor of violent extremism because of this erosion of confidence. Beyond that, beyond this breeding ground opportunity that COVID has created, internationally, the opportunities and the growing strength that violent extremist groups will benefit from and are benefiting from as a result of the pandemic will also have the perverse impact of making it more difficult for governments like the United States, governments in Europe, governments in Africa, governments everywhere, to do what many of us have been aspiring to do for several years now, which is, at the risk of oversimplifying this, do less when it comes to violent extremism so that we can do more about things like great power competition, near peer adversaries, and what have you. In my view, this expansion, this opportunity for expansion of violent extremism will end up confounding some of those aspirations. And instead of being able to treat this as a zero-sum game where we can afford to do less about terrorism and violent extremism so that we can do more of something else, will not work. I was dubious it would work before the pandemic. I'm much more dubious now. So at the risk of oversimplifying this, I think, unfortunately, it's very inconvenient, both at the policy level as well as the tactical level. But I think the United States government and American society is going to have to learn to walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. This idea that we're going to be able to afford to do less against terrorism when we're going to see terrorism get stronger because of this pandemic, I think is unrealistic. We're going to have to find a way to do both. Nobody wants that. I don't want that, but I think that is the reality. The final observation I'll share with you, some of you may have heard me speak about this in other venues before. I believe I've been seeing a convergence between violent extremism of many different types and the aspirations and the goals of some of our adversaries around the world for some time now. I believe that one of the consequences of the pandemic is that it will probably accelerate the convergence between violent extremist groups and some of the adversaries the United States faces. And it's for what I consider to be a pretty obvious reason. As these organizations are demonstrating increasingly sophisticated capabilities, these violent extremist organizations, everything from cyberspace to robotics and unmanned aerial systems and many other things besides, they become increasingly attractive proxies for other actors that will exhibit the behavior that mankind has seen in terms of proxy warfare since the dawn of human civilization. It's always convenient for a nation state in its pursuit of its own strategic goals and ambitions, whether in its region or around the world, to find somebody else who is both capable of achieving their goals, but also have the convenient aspect of it's somebody else doing the bleeding and dying for the nation state. So two quick examples of this are Russian ethnic separatists in the region of the Ukraine. Whether or not we call them terrorists, they are non-state actors using violence to achieve political goals, and they are being enabled as a proxy by the nation state of Russia. Another example, closer to home where I used to live, the Houthis in Yemen are a non-state actor using violence to accomplish their political goals. That, by definition, is a terrorist, whether or not we've officially enshrined them as a terrorist group. But they're the first world military technologies like surface-to-surface ballistic missiles, increasingly autonomous long-range drone attacks, and precision-guided anti-ship cruise missiles. We all know where they're getting that from. They're getting it from their great power patron called Iran. And I think we're going to see even more of this in coming years because these violent extremist groups, which we've traditionally viewed as comparatively primitive, not generally able to employ first world technology or capability, Those days are rapidly fading, and they are all going to be able to demonstrate first world capability and first world technology, because the barriers to entry to those technologies are falling all around us. Pretty much anyone with a credit card can purchase first world technology these days, and all of it can be turned to military purposes for one way or another. The last thing I'll say before closing is just an observation about something I've seen in recent dialogues inside the US government about the so-called digital attack surface of the United States. Usually this is in the context of preventing things like ransomware attacks on very important systems in the United States. Been getting a lot of press lately. We genuinely attribute these things to nation states. I think it's important to remember that as the attack surface, the digital attack surface of the United States has dramatically expanded in this year of pandemic, because so much of our population has migrated to venues like we're talking on right now. Telework is becoming normal now. That presents a vulnerable digital attack surface for violent extremists of all types who increasingly live on the internet, whether international or domestic. I know that's all been very uplifting, but I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much for outlining a series of challenges that are borderline impossible to respond to, at least in the short term. I'm guessing that John isn't going to provide us with cheerier information, but we'll pass it over to him right now for a take on the challenges and hopefully maybe some opportunities that the domestic space has created for us as we look at COVID and the domestic VEOs.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks to CNA for holding this important meeting.
I think we might have temporarily lost our connection with Mr. Cohen. I'm waiting to see if he pops back on. He's still connected. So I'm just going to give it about 60 seconds to see if it's a quick fix. If not, we'll jump to some questions and we'll interrupt ourselves and let him provide his remarks when he's able to rejoin us.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yep, we can hear you now.
Great. Well, I was just thanking CNA and thanking you, Meg, and thanking CNA for holding this important discussion. It's great to be with all of you today. On the cheery front, COVID did, in some respects, aid our ability to mitigate the threat posed by foreign terrorists, because international travel restrictions made it harder for operatives from abroad to travel to the U.S. So at the risk of not having anything cheery to say, I thought I would introduce that into the conversation. But from a domestic environment perspective, COVID and the spread of the pandemic introduced another layer of complexity, which I would argue was placed on top of what was already a complex evolution in the threat environment in the domestic space. So let me take us back pre-COVID to talk about what we were beginning to see occur in the United States, beginning in the 2013-2014 timeframe. As everybody listening knows, after September 11th, our primary concern regarding terrorist threats was focused on international or foreign terrorist organizations either deploying operatives to the United States or recruiting operatives within the United States to conduct attacks against the United States in furtherance of their ideological objectives. And in the years that followed September 11th, the United States invested in and built a global coalition and an expansive capability that allowed us to not only detect emerging threats, but target the leadership of foreign terrorist organizations, disrupt their ability to operate, to detect and mitigate threats against the U.S. and its interests. And it was highly successful through the efforts of people like General Nagata and the intelligence community and military and special operations and law enforcement. we were able to disrupt the operations of foreign terrorist organizations, hunt down their leadership, identify operatives, and keep the country a lot safer. My concern is that the threat we face today is a threat that robust counterterrorism capability may not be suited to address. Because while we were focused in the past on a threat that I would describe as being based in organizational dynamics, the threat we face today, particularly within the United States, is much more individual based. And while individuals may self-connect with the ideology of an international terrorist organization or a domestic extremist group or domestic extremist ideology, for the most part, what we're finding is that these are people who are ideologically unsophisticated. They may connect with a blend of ideological beliefs, and woven throughout their belief system is a series of personal grievances. And they operate and communicate in a way that doesn't allow them to be detected using the traditional intelligence collection and other capabilities that we employed so many times in the past to prevent attacks against the United States. So what are we saying? The primary terrorism threat facing the domestic environment today comes from lone individuals or small groups of individuals who self-connect with an ideological belief system or a combination of belief systems, or perhaps a blend of personal grievances. They then go out and conduct an act of violence on behalf of that belief system or grievance with very little communication with a defined extremist organization or international terrorist group. Much of this process of self-connection with the ideological belief system or systems occurs in the digital street. These are individuals who share a number of behavioral characteristics, one of which is they spend an inordinate amount of time online, consuming material placed there in the online environment by extremist thought leaders, by international terrorist groups, sometimes by foreign intelligence services, for the specific purposes of influencing and inspiring violent behavior. The people that are susceptible to being influenced by this online content and the people who are being specifically targeted with this online content are individuals who, regardless of their ideological belief system they eventually connect with, share common behavioral characteristics. They tend to be disaffected. They tend to be people who experience a series of life failures. They come from dysfunctional family environments. They are craving a sense of social connection, and they're craving a sense of accomplishment. And ultimately, they come to conclude that the best way to achieve those two goals and the best way to express their anger is through the use of violence, which they ultimately go in and conduct. So this is a threat that, as I said, is very individualized based. In fact, there's an expression we've begun using over the last several years. And for counterterrorism officials, this is very troubling. I realize that when I say it's not the ideology, it's the psychology. Or as it was described to me several years back by the then head of counterterrorism at the FBI is, John, he said, the primary threat we face today is we have a lot of angry people who are looking for an excuse to be able to use violence as a way to express their anger. And so the fuel for this violent extremist violence that we're experiencing in the US today primarily comes from online content and the consumption of that online content. So that was the threat as it was pre-COVID. So how did COVID impact the domestic environment as it was evolving? Well, one, it created for many a sense of social isolation. Stores were closed down, movie theaters were closed down, our society was closed down. People stayed at home. They didn't go to work, or if they worked online. They were more socially isolated when they were before. That was hard for a lot of us. But for those who are craving a sense of social connection, it was devastating. And how did they respond? They spent more time online, playing violent online games or consuming violent or extremist material. And in some cases, it was that activity that actually gave them the validation or the sense of purpose to go out and commit a violent act. What else did it do? COVID also became a topic that was used by those who were seeking to incite violence by posting online material. It became a part of the narrative they used, as it was described earlier by Pam and Mike. In some cases, you began to see the government's public health restrictions being woven into the narrative of those extremist thought leaders who were trying to convince people that the government that was in place in the United States was illegitimate, that it needed to be removed. It was the duty for all true patriots to resist. Oh, and by the way, evidence of that is they've created this myth known as COVID, and they're forcing us to stay at home, and it's all part of the evil conspiracy. That was a narrative that was not only posted by extremist thought leaders, but it started to be posted by foreign nation states who saw the value in trying to destabilize American society, undermine confidence in the government, and incite violence and discord in the streets of our communities. You started to see narratives that not only called into question the severity of the pandemic, but also called into question the medical strategies that were being employed to reduce the harm in our country. So it was no longer a discussion on the medical efficacy of vaccines. Vaccines became known in extremist circles as another effort by the government to exert unreasonable control over the populace. So in addition to creating more opportunity of social isolation and therefore more opportunity for people to be influenced by online material, issues associated with COVID became woven into the narratives that were being used by threat actors, both abroad and domestically, in order to sow discord, undermine confidence in the government, disrupt or destabilize our society, and sometimes even incite or inspire acts of violence. So as we are coming out of the COVID pandemic restrictions, and as the restrictions in parts of the country or in communities across the country are becoming relaxed, we at the department are extraordinarily concerned that we still have the underlying polarization and anger that was fueling the evolution in the domestic threat environment. It's been exacerbated to some degree because of a year and a half of social isolation, economic impact that came with it with COVID. But now we're opening up, and you have people now returning to public spaces. And as the general will tell you, it becomes a more target-rich environment. So at the department, we are focusing on what we can do, working with the traditional counterterrorism community in order to mitigate the risks. And I'll be happy to talk about that more as we get into the question and answer portion.
I'm not sure I believed it was possible to be more dire, but that might be the most depressing of the sort of three outcomes we've heard so far today, particularly the sort of frame of thinking about all of the intense feelings of anger and frustration laying on top of an already kind of thick layer of that. That's and certainly this kind of language, if it's not ideology but psychology, it's very difficult to address psychological levels at a population level, or psychological issues at a population level. So we're gonna start with some questions now. I see one that's in the chat, and I have a couple lined up. But I wanted to remind you all to please submit your questions via the Q&A feature, because it's a little bit easier for us to keep track. I want to start off with a question, sort of about. Sort of glibly put, it's a question about whether or not we should really be having a serious conversation about COVID and VEOs, right? Which is to say, it's going to be tempting to look at COVID as this sort of once in 100 years event, right? We had a pandemic nearly 100 years ago. We're having one now. And we just need to get through this experience, and it doesn't have to change anything in a major way, right? We'll weather this experience and we'll emerge on the other side, and things will kind of go back to normal, right? We've heard a lot of talk in the past year about getting back to normal. And certainly we don't want VEOs to get back to normal, but the normal pattern of sort of VEOs engaging in their operations and the U.S. government partners responding. So the question I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is, what do you think? What are the risks of treating this as a one-off that won't repeat? What are the sort of critical things that we should be changing, and that we should learn from this? And why should we not treat this as sort of just a temporary thing to sort of survive and then move on from?
Well, I'll take the first whack at that because you're touching on something that I fret about a lot. If we fail to do what you've just described, in my view, we'll simply be extending a pretty dismal track record of constantly paying inadequate attention to, pick your favorite term, root causes, drivers, conditions that create violent extremism. I'm remembering a really frustrating conversation I had before I retired where a senior official was telling me he was sick and tired of talking about root causes of terrorism. And I mean, I have some sympathy for that position, I guess, because it's the hardest part of counterterrorism. I mean, what I used to do as for a living is in many ways the easy part. I mean, it's dangerous, but capturing and killing terrorists is complicated and difficult, but it doesn't even come close to how complex and difficult doing away with the drivers and the root causes. So I guess I can understand why this former senior official told me he was sick and tired of talking about it, because it's really frustrating and it's really difficult and it's really complex. So, you know, if you want to be lazy, yeah, don't focus on it. But the price is you'll never solve the problem. If we skip over this topic as an important aspect of our future when it comes to violent extremism, we're simply continuing a really perverse behavior pattern of thinking that it is sufficient just to deal with the threats as they emerge without ever doing what is necessary to prevent people from joining the ranks of terrorist movements. Over.
Yeah, I think Mike's right. I mean, I think it's important to focus on it, on the impact that COVID has had on the threat environment. But I think it's also to really understand how it's impacted the threat environment. I don't see necessarily the focus on COVID as a standalone activity. I see it as part of a continuum. Because the threat actors that are seeking to incite violent behavior haven't exclusively focused on on narratives associated with COVID. They've incorporated narratives associated with COVID as part of a broader effort to influence behavior and times even incite violence. So whether it's the focus on discussions on race, on immigration, on the Second Amendment, on COVID. These are all topics that are used on literally a daily basis by foreign and domestic threat actors, international terrorist groups, foreign intelligence services, domestic extremist thought leaders, the people who are like-minded abroad. They pick those efforts purposely because part of the playbook they are following calls for the identification of those fractures in our society, then the use of online material to exacerbate those fractures. They are trying to find what angers people, what are those issues in our country that are causing anger and polarization, and then they develop in a highly sophisticated manner narratives that they introduce through social media and proxy websites that they seek to amplify and eventually become incorporated into the mainstream media ecosystem. They're looking for those narratives that they know are going to evoke a response. And they'll take both sides of an issue because they're not there to advocate for a policy resolution. They are there to exacerbate the social tensions. And in some cases, that results in political activity. But sometimes, particularly for those in our society who are vulnerable to being influenced to engage in violence, it can result in violent activity. And then one last thing I'll say real quick is, what this also requires us to do is to think differently at a tactical level on how we mitigate the risk posed by an individual who comes onto our radar screen. Because in many cases, it may be the efforts of a joint terrorism task force that's most effective. But there have been a number of examples where individuals who come to the attention of law enforcement don't meet the threshold for a JTTF investigation, but they still pose a high risk of committing an act of violence. So we need to think differently at a tactical level in the domestic environments, how we're going to deal with those people as well. And that's one of the areas that the department's really been focused on.
Yeah, and I'll just add some thoughts on this where, you know, in my view, something can simultaneously be a once-in-a-lifetime event, hopefully a once-in-a-lifetime event, and have these real paradigm shifting impacts in the long term. And so it's not an either or in my mind, and we don't really know what the impacts will be. Arguably, COVID has not even fully kind of hit certain parts of the world yet, right? And so I think that these long-term impacts really speak to the underlying vulnerabilities that we're all discussing here. And some natural or man-made disasters, they have multi-generational impacts. And so we have to think about that. And the conversation's changing in real time. This is a difficult thing to discuss. There's new data every day. But if we recall the conversation from last March, there were kind of two lines of thought. One, this is something we've never experienced before. This is one of the huge events of the century. And then there was also, this is a storm in a teacup conversation of, does this really going to have that long-term impact? And I think we've seen that it is having that impact, but we're still learning about it every day. And just one final point, I think that what this highlights is the impact of what we can call non-traditional threats, like pandemics, on what are typically seen as traditional threats, like violent extremist organizations and other groups. And the intersection of that, COVID has really forced us to get at that issue.
No, that's all very helpful from the three of you. I particularly appreciated, Pamela, that you deconstructed my question and rejected its very foundation. But we've got a couple questions, so I want to sort of turn to the ones coming in from the audience. And the first question I want to ask is, one of the things that John, that you particularly highlighted was that some of the tools and techniques we've used and developed in the post 9/11 era aren't necessarily appropriate or applicable to the current challenges we're facing because of how folks are radicalizing online. But I'm wondering if there are approaches we've taken, or the question I'm looking at asks whether or not the approaches we've taken, or there are specific approaches that we've taken overseas that could be adopted for domestic CT as that challenge begins to escalate. And I suppose that's a question particularly for John and Mike.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So we're beginning to see increased collaboration and communication, or I should flip that around, increased communication and collaboration between racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists here in the United States and like-minded individuals and even groups of individuals abroad. So we are beginning to see the exchange in resources using cryptocurrencies. We're beginning to see increased communication, some of the screening and vetting and travel pattern analysis work that we've done in the past to deal with the movement of foreign terrorist operatives provide an opportunity for us to identify potential plots or individuals who may be seeking to operate tactically within the United States. I think part of the challenge, though, is that particularly from a watch listing perspective, much of the authorities, there's a lot more clarity as it relates to authorities to watch list individuals associated with foreign terrorist organizations. It's much more complicated when thinking about placing greater scrutiny on travelers or denying boarding of a traveler to somebody who's associated with a domestic terrorist cause. The close proximity of constitutionally protected speech, the lack of a formal designation process for domestic terrorist organizations, that makes it a very complex environment when thinking about watch listing somebody or no boarding. So those are some of the challenges we're dealing with today. What I was referencing before, though, is we built an extensive capability to detect communications between terrorist operatives who are perhaps operating in the United States and other members of a foreign terrorist organization. We built great capacity to understand, track the travel of foreign terrorist operatives who are operating within the international transportation environment. We developed great capabilities to be able to find, fix, and address the activities of terrorist leaders operating in foreign countries and using intelligence gathered through those operations to identify different operatives. That's not going to work in dealing with domestic terrorists. And while the FBI does a great job investigating domestic terrorist organizations and people associated with those organizations, if you're an individual sitting in his basement or her basement, spending 15 hours a day online, becoming increasingly angry, self-connecting with a cause, identifying a target based on your familiarity with that target because you've been there, and then going out and using your car, a knife, or a legally purchased gun, it's going to be very difficult for those counterterrorism tools to be employed to deal with that type of individual.
All right. I think that both policymakers, practitioners, and the broader American public need a better grasp of the fact that I would not suggest that there's nothing that is transferable from our work and the enormous skill we have developed, as was mentioned earlier, in dealing with international terrorism, to the degree to which that can actually be effectively or appropriately brought into the domestic arena. It's not that there's nothing that cannot be transferred, but my personal view, it's a fairly small number of things. And even those things, we're going to have to be really careful about things that John's already mentioned, like privacy rights, constitutional rights, just American expectations about what the appropriate role of government is in their lives. So let me be a little more specific. First of all, I would argue there's a lesson we learned the hard way in international terrorism that I hope doesn't take us as long to learn in the domestic space. But people like me, after decades of killing and capturing terrorists, we got to the point we started saying, we're not going to kill our way out of this. Well, we're not going to arrest our way out of this inside the United States. Are there people that are going to need to be arrested? Absolutely. They're guilty of murder or arson or what have you. They should absolutely be arrested, and if convicted, they should have the consequences that their crime merits. But what we came to lament in our international efforts was something I alluded to earlier. We weren't sufficiently aggressive or risk tolerant or willing to provide enough resources to do the things necessary in the international arena to reduce the scale and the volume and the frequency with which people were joining the ranks of the organizations we were seeking to dismember. We really need to absorb that lesson now in the domestic arena and understand if the U.S. government doesn't come up with a much more effective panoply of activities to engage and enlist and support local communities, local actors, local civic leaders, and what have you, we're not going to arrest our way out of this. So that's kind of point number two. The final observation I'll give you, or point I'll try to make here, is that, as has already been alluded to, much of what is happening is occurring online, but we need to remember that as dangerous as these various domestic ideologies are, just like ideologies associated with Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, etc., are very dangerous. They're not the only game in town. And personally, I became a convert about something while I was in my last assignment as the director of strategy at the National Counterterrorism Center. I think something that I was guilty of underappreciating for several decades that I'm not an expert in, but I really do appreciate now, and I hope the US government comes to appreciate, is that mental health plays an enormous role in whether or not people become violent extremists, whether internationally or domestically. I do subscribe to the notion there is a mental health crisis in the United States that has been growing for decades. If we don't get a handle on that, I'm not sure that much else we do will matter in the end. Over.
If I can just jump in, I mean, what Mike just said is critically important, and it's an underlying, it's part of the foundation of the work or the approach that the Department of Homeland Security is now taking. To complement the work of a joint terrorism task force and the traditional law enforcement techniques, that are employed in the domestic environment, we are looking very hard at what more we can do to support at the community level a public health model approach to dealing with the increasing number of acts of targeted violence in the U.S., particularly those that are ideologically motivated or personally grievance motivated. And a big part of that solution set is providing law enforcement the tools and the relationships they need to work with mental health professionals, faith leaders, community leaders, to evaluate the risk posed by an individual, to develop a threat management strategy, which very often is increased mental health support for that person. Again, the people who are committing the vast majority of violence in the United States, terrorism-like violence in the United States, are people who have underlying behavioral health issues, come from dysfunctional family environments. They are dealing with a pattern of life failures. They're angry. They feel like they've been victimized by society. They come to the place where they want to use violence as a way to express their anger, and they go online and find the permission slip to do that. And if you were to place them in a room with an ideological expert to de-radicalize them, they don't really understand the ideologies they're connecting with anyway. It's the sense of social connection. There was a reason why the Islamic State started posting videos, by the way, several years back, that showed the brotherhood and sisterhood of those who traveled to the caliphate and who were they were almost in a movie trailer type environment, were showing these actions of their fighters as heroic, fighting the great evils of the world. It resonated with people who were searching for social connection, a sense of belonging, and a sense of accomplishment. And it was a very intended effort, purposeful effort by the Islamic State to do that. Violent extremist thought leaders are doing the same thing. You see increasingly groups like Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and other sort of fringe organizations using this online material that's been meant to instill a sense of pride and partnership and family to people they're trying to influence their behavior. And you can become part of the family by joining us as a group, or you can become part of the family by going out and killing people on behalf of the group.
You know, in a conversation that doesn't have perhaps a lot of bright spots, I'll note that what was said in the last few minutes actually represents a remarkable evolution on the sort of discussion about mental health and terrorism over the past, say, 30 to 40 years, where sort of you had early models that were really oriented around sort of mental illness and sort of terrorists as being crazy or psychopaths. And then it went through sort of the scholarship went through a phase of rejecting this in sort of favor of models suggesting that most terrorists were mentally healthy for good reason. I think there's been a lot of research on how sociopaths and psychopaths don't actually make good team members, and terrorists in some circumstances really need to rely on one another. But the nuance of the conversation that you two just had, Mike and John, is just really sort of wonderful, and I think a really bright spot in this, right, where we can sort of acknowledge a population that's sort of struggling with a spate of mental health concerns without labeling them as mentally ill in a pejorative fashion, without saying that they're crazy, without it does make me wonder also, as we've sort of faced what everybody has been describing as the coming mental health crisis in the wake of COVID, if we might see a more robust set of tools developed to help people deal with mental health concerns that don't sort of rise to the level of pathology that we're typically that we're tempted to associate with mental health issues. So that's just to call attention to, I think, a beacon of hope in a bleak trajectory. Then the next question is actually comes in two parts. So the first part is a pretty straightforward question, right? Which is to say, since COVID began, have violent domestic groups been talking more? Has there been more sort of chatter? Has there been more online engagement with domestic groups? And have they been acting more? John, you spoke to a trajectory that really started in 2013, 2014. So I think the question is, since last January, February, have we seen an uptick? And then the second part of the question, which I think goes to all of you, is what do you think the best solutions are for preventing these groups domestically, given some of the challenges? Now, you've already both spoken about some of the things we can't do. So I think this question kind of flips it and asks, what are the best solutions? John, you've highlighted the value of a public health model, but I think the person is asking for you all to weigh in a little bit more on this.
Yeah, it's always hard to say, is there more now, or are they more visible? I mean, I'll answer that by saying we're seeing a significant amount of communication. We're seeing a significant amount of communication, both in private environments, but also in public environments. I heard an expression from a representative from the tech industry a couple of weeks back who said, in the world of violent extremism, they plan in private and play in public. And what that means is you may have planning, strategic, and communications that are occurring on encrypted or closed platforms. But part of the game plan is to get certain narratives out as broadly as possible. So one of the things that we look at are not just narratives from the perspective, is this a narrative that may influence or incite violent behavior, but how fast is it spreading and how far is it spreading? The more people that you expose to the narrative, the more likely it is that you're going to influence people's behavior. So we're seeing a lot of activity. I'm sure everybody's heard about the lead up to January 6th. There was a significant amount of online activity that had come to the attention of law enforcement and intelligence officials, but it goes into the second part of your question, is what are some of the things that we're doing? We need to think, look, I've been involved in this business for 35 years, and we need to think differently about how we look at intelligence today. We're not that we ever did regularly, but we're not going to get that intercept between two operatives giving us the details of an operation. We're going to see a lot of information that's woven in between constitutionally protected speech and people just being angry and posturing online and sarcasm. But we need to make sure our analysts are thinking differently about what they're seeing on this online space and understanding the behavioral dynamics. We also, just really quickly, we need to think differently about how we talk to the community, how we engage with members of the community, how we educate community members to be attuned to threat-related behaviors of concern. We need to build trust between the community and the authorities, because one could say, as part of this perfect storm we're in, just to make everybody a little bit more depressed, we're moving towards an environment where our solutions absolutely require effective communication and collaboration between the authorities and the community at a time where there's a significant portion of this country that just do not trust government and do not trust law enforcement in particular. So part of our strategy is we have to regain that trust or build that trust and build those lines of communication. And then finally, just real quick, it's like, and I totally agree with what Mike was saying, there will be people and groups of people that we will arrest and we will prosecute and we will put in prison. And there will be attacks that we stop because some family member or a coworker or a schoolmate picks up the phone or texts the local authorities. They do a risk assessment. They see this person as high risk and they address the underlying social, behavioral, psychological, economic, or those underlying issues that are pushing that person down the path toward violence. And that's got to be a big part of our approach, these community-based prevention programs. And we're beginning, we just at the department dramatically expanded the amount of resources that are available through our grant programs for these types of community-based prevention programs. We're expanding the amount of, or we're focusing increasingly the monies that can be used by state and local fusion centers, police departments, and others to engage in multidisciplinary analytic activities. So I think the good news here is I'm beginning to see a much greater appreciation within the Justice Department, within the DOD, within the intelligence community, within DHS, within state and local communities across the country, that we have to have a much bigger toolbox, or a much different toolbox than the one we used to deal with the threat, in the days that followed September 11th.
Pamela, if you want to say something, I've been taking up too much microphone time, but otherwise I'll jump in.
You can go ahead, Mike.
Okay, I have 4 suggestions, I guess. One, rather predictably, is I think that whatever our mechanisms are going to be for dealing with domestic violent extremism, it needs more resources. This is not an error. I mean, one thing I know, because I benefited from it, I know how many billions of dollars we lavished on international terrorism efforts. I'm not suggesting it will take that scale of funding to deal with our domestic problems, but it will take more money that is currently being allocated, that's for sure. Now, there are some steps being taken. I want to acknowledge, for example, particularly given my own heritage, that the recently passed legislation regarding Asian American hate crimes appears to be an indication that we're going to not only make this more strategically important, but probably will get more resources. I'm sure resources will follow the legislation. But I am a little worried, as I kind of alluded to earlier, that there's a pretty deep-seated reflexive attitude in our own government that we're going to arrest our way out of this problem. I noticed, for example, in the recently passed legislation, it was primarily about creating a more powerful law enforcement response, which I vote for. You know, people that commit these kinds of crimes ought to be arrested and prosecuted, but that's not the solution. That's not the answer. It's a necessary step, but it won't get us to the goal line. Second thing I'll offer is, this is a personal opinion here. I know there are some people both in and out of government who disagree with me about this, but it's something I researched pretty heavily. Well, it's actually odd I'm using that word, but I studied this pretty heavily while I was in government. There's very little empirical scientific research on why people become violent extremists. There's no shortage of anecdote and personal opinion on this topic. But if you actually look for how much empirical research has been done, whether it's on international terrorism or domestic terrorism, it really doesn't matter. The amount of empirical research on this question is wafer thin. And I'm very worried, I've been worried for a long time, that we're going to remain guilty of a very age-old intellectual trap. You can't solve a problem that you don't understand. And I don't think we sufficiently understand this problem. It's not that we know nothing, we do not know enough. Thirdly, we've already talked about it, so I'll be brief here, but as John and I have both talked about, the methods by which the federal government interacts with state, local, and community organizations, leaders, and individuals, including all the way down to families, by the way, has got to get better. There are some wonderful, courageous people in fusion centers and JTTFs around the country who are trying, but the amount of training and education that is delivered to help a field agent or a local DHS officer, or what have you, to know how to effectively interact at these levels is pretty thin. That's another resource question, but it also will require a certain amount of courage, because when things go wrong at the local level, you will immediately read about it in the newspapers. You will immediately see it on TV, and it will require a certain amount of courage at the policy level to say, listen, we got to take our lumps. We have to keep going, even if we occasionally get in public trouble. And then finally, it's an extension of what I just said. People like I used to be at the federal level need to understand that we cannot do this ourselves. And if we try, we're going to regret it, particularly in countries like the United States, where it is just too unwelcome to have, quote, the feds arrive and trying to start doing things at local levels. There's so much, there are so many antibodies against that kind of behavior that it's a mistake to try. And I'm not suggesting that the federal government should do nothing. It just needs to recognize that it's so limited in its ability to create strategic effects at local levels that it has to enlist local actors in ways that currently, in large measure, the federal government does not know how to do.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a fantastic conversation, so not to belabor the point, but just, you know, one thread that I agree with that's being kind of pulled through here is a balance between developing the capabilities and having the funding to respond to incidents and threats, and also heavily prioritizing prevention at the individual level, the social level, the community level. And I think that's the struggle. It's finding that right balance. And
There's also, I mean, as I listen to you all speak, there's also really interesting opportunities here, right? So, John, one of the things you highlighted was the sort of reality of perceptions about policing in the United States right now, and how that presents a challenge that needs to be overcome, that relationship with the community needs to be strengthened. But one of the other sort of opportunities that presents as an opportunity to sort of foreground mental health professionals and public health models. It's a lot easier to reach out to a public health fusion center and report your child who you're concerned about than it is to reach out to the local police station. And so these challenges can also be presenting opportunities, I think, in some of these spaces.
Can I offer something? Because you just touched on something that I'm personally concerned about, because I think if we're not careful, we're going to see a bad movie again. I think most people remember right after 9/11, there was a very strong emphasis on enlisting social scientists and anthropologists to support military, law enforcement, et cetera, efforts against terrorism. And for a while, that was well regarded, but it faded pretty quickly. And unfortunately, it ended up with a lot of these social scientists and anthropologists being scorned by their own professions as being, complicit in, immoral or illegal activities abroad. And I'm not trying to relitigate that, but it would be a tragedy, and it would be strategically dysfunctional if in the U.S. government's efforts to enlist psychologists, social scientists, what have you, for domestic reasons, we again mishandle it in a way where these very professionals that are so important for the kinds of approaches we need to take end up being reviled by their colleagues, because we've inadvertently allowed an impression that they're engaging in inappropriate or unethical or just, damaging activities, even though that's not what they're doing. But I saw this movie happen with anthropologists. It would be a tragedy if that repeated itself here.
But Mike, that's a great point, and I think I go back to something else you and Pamela talked about. To solve a problem, you have to understand the problem. And I think one of the things that concerns me a little bit is, and we all know this from our colleagues who we know and love, there's a tendency in our world, in the intelligence and law enforcement world, to place threats into definitional categories. Oh, this person is this type of terrorist. This person is this type of extremist. What we have learned through analysis over the past 4 or 5 years is that the current threat and those that are engaged in violent behavior underneath the umbrella of the threat environment don't necessarily fit into those definitional boxes. You probably remember when we were talking about countering violent extremism, right? And the idea was, well, if you could just get moderate imams to sit down with people who are becoming radicalized, that would solve the problem. In today's environment, we found out that there was so much distrust in the community, and there were some things that we really didn't understand about the threat, that it wasn't really a great strategy anyway. But today, even if you were to employ that strategy, the people we're seeing who are going out and committing attacks on behalf of ISIS or Al-Qaeda or white supremacy, they don't always really understand the ideology, and that's not the point anyway. For them, it's, I'm part of this group, my pattern of failure is over, I'm going to end that pattern of failure by going out and committing mass murder. And that's a very different problem. It doesn't mean that we can't address it. It doesn't mean that there aren't things we can do to prevent these attacks. It just means it may not fit into the definitional categories that makes intelligence analysts or law enforcement investigators comfortable.
Amen.
So I actually want to pivot a little bit. There's a question about cyber attacks that I wanted to pose to you, particularly, Mike, a little bit in the wake of your comment about sort of increased digital vulnerability of the United States. The question is, in recognition of the fact that cyber attacks, and particularly I think ransomware attacks, have rapidly increased against critical infrastructure and vulnerable parts of the population, such as hospitals, what are your thoughts on senior officials comparing or equating cyber attacks to terrorist attacks, to sort of more conventionally define terrorist attacks? Should these be in the same category? What are the pros and cons?
I'm going to give what may sound like a bit of a contradictory answer. First of all, I think it's an easy argument and a good argument to make that many of these cyber intrusions, cyber disruptions, or cyber attacks like happen for solar winds and what have you, can legitimately be called terrorism, because even though they're not physical acts of violence, they're still disruptions or attacks on very important entities for the United States, and to whatever degree they're for a political purpose. And some of these clearly are for a political purpose, although they immediately deny it. Yeah, then that, as far as I'm concerned, that certainly meets the Webster's dictionary definition of terrorism. But I actually don't find that conclusion to be particularly helpful. I think what's more important is that the pathways to solving this problem, even though we're never going to do away with it, right? That there's never going to be zero cyber intrusion, cyber attacks, but the path to substantially, strategically reducing the scale of this threat is not going to be found in how well we do cyber defenses. I vote for doing better cybersecurity. I vote for doing better cyber defenses. But, I think it was General Patton who famously said that fixed fortifications are monuments to the stupidity of mankind. His point, rather crudely made, was people will always find a way around your defenses. I vote for stronger defenses. I vote for stronger cybersecurity, but there's got to be a different kind of effort to reduce the attractiveness of doing this kind of activity. I don't know what a prevention model would look like here. But in my personal opinion, if we don't find some kind of prevention model that actually works, that makes it less attractive, whether it's just some random hacker or it's a nation state to engage in these kinds of activities, what we're going to see is we're going to see more of it. We're going to see more of it because it's so easy to do. I mean, you have to have a certain amount of technological sophistication, but the internet is expanding so fast. And it has so many vulnerabilities, including inside the United States, that this is only going to get worse and worse and worse unless we somehow figure out a way to make the idea of doing it less attractive globally. Over.
Yeah, and I can add something to that. I think that in some degree, it highlights the ability of an adversary to be innovative in their ways to test vulnerabilities, right? And those vulnerabilities, that's what many of these attacks are, right? They're kind of little tests and seeing how far you can get and what the response will be. And I think that, in talking about which groups would do this, whether it's a state actor, whether it's a non-state armed group, whether, it's an individual, that's kind of a capabilities question. But once the standard has been set that this is an option, that can be concerning for groups across the board.
Meg, if I can just add, I think this is an interesting part of the conversation because we still have a tendency to think of cyber attacks and even influence operations as something separate and distinct than operational activities employed by a threat actor. So if I don't remember what the name of the crime family was, but if in The Godfather, we heard the Godfather start talking about not just expanding into narcotics trade, but to begin conducting cyber attacks to steal the identity of people to engage in fraudulent activity, we wouldn't say, oh, well, let's not conduct an organized crime investigation. Let's just build up our cyber defenses. And it's a little bit in public policy. We're still at a place, the Russians didn't interfere in the election because they wanted to just simply interfere with the election. It was a part of an asymmetric form of warfare that they've been employing against the United States in an effort to sow discord, destabilize our society, undermine confidence in our government, undermine our relationships with NATO and our European Union allies, because it was in their best interest. It allowed them to project themselves geopolitically more effectively to do that. There's a professor in Rutgers University, Jeffrey Lane, who said something that I always remembered. He said, we tend to think of what happens in the digital street as a reflection of the physical world. He says that's the wrong way to look at it. The digital street and the physical street are intertwined. So to your question, is it terrorism? It depends. Is it a technique being used by a foreign terrorist organization or a domestic extremist group to achieve their ideological objectives by creating terror and by creating a physical outcome that promotes their ideological goals? If a foreign intelligence service uses disinformation as part of an active measures program, it's still a covert operation. So I think part of the challenge that we're facing still in government is we tend to think of cyber attacks as one thing and physical attacks as something different. And today they're combined. You have to look at who's doing it and what's their motive.
Fantastic. Again, I particularly appreciate the focus on tactics and techniques as opposed to groups and ideologies. I think it resonates with what you said earlier, particularly, John, about ideology not really being the sort of binding force that we used to think of it as. So the next question is a little bit different. And Pamela, I'm going to toss it to you first. The question is are panelists aware of any VEO groups who are using human rights derogation arising from the pandemic to pursue their objectives? And if so, how are they using them? But I think we could probably expand it, Pamela, a little bit to ask also about some state governments that are using these to fight VEOs.
Sure. I'm not sure if I'm going to get exactly at the question because I'm not sure if I know exactly what it's referring to, but I will say that, we have seen that one risk of the pandemic is that state governments, right? So either leaders or state-based actors will kind of use the pandemic as either a legitimate or illegitimate justification to change certain legal precedents or to change laws that could include, human rights laws, individual liberty laws, to essentially either respond directly to the pandemic, so kind of control populations in a way that will prevent the flow of or the spread of the pandemic, or to react to other to kind of clamp down on other domestic security issues that they see, and that could be violent extremist groups within their own borders. And so we did see that, right? And I think that we will have to kind of go on a case-by-case basis to see whether or not these changes were legitimate, because you did see across the world kind of an expansion of emergency authorities and public health emergencies and things like that. But you did also see certain authoritarian actors using COVID to kind of expand their ability to control their populations, if you will. And so, I'm not sure if I'm quite getting at the human rights lens, because I don't know as much about that, but I think that it is a risk. And within VEO groups themselves, I don't know how concerned many of these groups are, particularly with human rights to begin with. So I'll leave it there. But I do think that it is a concern. I'm happy to answer in more detail in a follow-up question.
Hey, Megan, I'll offer you an observation. Again, it's a little tangential to your question, but I think important nonetheless, is that I don't think enough policymakers or just average American citizens like myself yet grasp one of the consequences of the pandemic, where because everybody's been isolated in their homes, more dependent on media like we're talking on right now to communicate and interact or buy things online or what have you. I mean, it's just unprecedented how much of our lives moved into the digital arena because of COVID, and it's never going to go back to the way it was. I mean, that's already obvious. This expansion has also resulted in, I'm going to use a particular example. I'm not trying to get hung up on this example, but I think it's a good example. I mean, how many Americans in the past year, because they were more dependent on mediums like this to live their lives, have agreed to maybe hundreds of new end user agreements? The thing that comes up when you're signing up for Zoom or signing up for a new piece of software, and there's the 100-page long end user agreement you're never going to read. You just click that you agree. What have you given up when you clicked you agree? Well, you've given up a lot. I mean, Amazon knows more about me and my family than the United States government ever will. And I'm not trying to be facetious here. The point I'm making is we do not understand the consequences of how much of our lives and, oh, by the way, our personal information is now available to anyone who can purchase it for the right price from the various companies that have been harvesting it. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing these things. I'm just saying we don't understand the consequences. And some of these consequences will overlap with what violent extremists seek to do.
Yeah, no, I think you've highlighted two things here, right? Which is to say that I think, Pamela, you've spoken a little bit to sort of government use of COVID, sort of COVID innovations to crack down on human rights in some places, right? So limiting public gatherings, for example, is a really effective way to reduce transmission, but it's also a very effective way to prevent public protest from occurring. And Mike, I think the connection there is you're highlighting a suite of tools, right? Some of which could potentially sort of be put to malign use, and with many of us unwittingly participating. I'm going to try to squish in one last question here, with the knowledge that we only have 3 minutes left. But the question is a pretty straightforward one, although that doesn't necessarily mean a quick answer. Are there any particular terrorist groups that you think have especially benefited from COVID? Or do you think that the effect is more of a blanket one that exacerbates risk factors for all terrorist groups generally and roughly equally?
Happy to jump in first here. So I think, I would answer that by thinking about what we mean by directly versus indirectly being benefited from COVID. I would say that there are some groups that have directly benefited from COVID in that the populations that they target have been directly impacted by COVID. And then, and then there are also groups who are more indirectly benefited because, while COVID hasn't necessarily ravaged those communities in the same way, the counterterrorism efforts to counter those groups have been limited. And so I know most about VEOs across Africa, so just to provide some examples there, ISIS-affiliated groups, there's, there's evidence that there's increased activity from those groups. There's also concern that groups across the Sahel, so Boko Haram and East Africa, so Al-Shabaab, that are ongoing efforts to counter those groups have been either diminished or postponed or disrupted or just weakened for a whole host of reasons. And those communities haven't experienced COVID in the same way that we have in the US and in other places, but there's still an impact there. And as for direct impact, and again, I know less about this, so I would hand it over to the other panelists, but I think far-right organizations across Europe and across the US are probably more directly benefited from it because of the scapegoating and other means that they can use. And apologies for my voice.
We are actually out of time, so I'm gonna actually let Pamela have had the last word there on this topic. I want to thank you all again so much for joining us. I hope to see you at another one of CNA's NSS events. And I want to thank particularly Pamela, Mike, and John for spending an hour and a half with us and answering your difficult questions and forecasting lots of gloom for the future. We really appreciate your expertise and your joining us in this conversation. So thank you so much again. And again, we look forward to seeing you all sometime soon.